Welcome class, I am Matt Lorenzen and I'm your professor, and we are going to review the first chapter of your Human Development text by Robert Cale and John Kavanagh, the 7th edition. These video lectures are meant to not be super comprehensive, but to go over some important points, to help illustrate some fun things and make the class video interactive. And so here we go. Let's take a look at the fun topics in chapter 1. So some recurring issues in human development the text kind of first goes over, and I think they're really exciting too. The first one is nature-nurture and the idea of the influence of heredity versus your environment. And so nature is the heredity part, and nurture, being nurtured, right, is the environment part. And a lot of times it's posed as a nature versus nurture, but in this class I'm going to pose it as, and what people are looking at today, of course, is that it's more of a nature and nurture, and how there's this really unique and interesting interaction between the two. And also the idea of the mind as a tabula rasa, which is what John Watson, the behaviorist, talked about, which is the mind is a blank slate, and then through learning, reward, and punishment, basically the mind becomes formed. Or does it have innate universal structures already built within, wired within, that of course is influenced by learning? Remember, we have the nature and nurture through neuroplasticity, for example, where you have experiences, learning that actually changes the neural connections in your brain. And of course you have structures in your brain, but a lot of your thinking right now and processing and memory has to do with neural connections. So those experiences, that neuroplasticity, the idea of growth mindset, of learning and working through challenges and actually growing your brain and becoming becoming more intelligent and having a stronger brain. And then coming back to here, are there innate universal structures like the language acquisition device that Noam Chomsky talked about? Object permanence, it's been shown as early as, I believe, 6 or 7 months in infants. And that's the idea that objects can't pass through one another, that when shown a ball that rolls behind this sort of drawbridge kind of thing, and they see the ball roll behind this sort of piece of cardboard or whatever, and then it hits it repeatedly and it stops the cardboard each time, and then the infant gets bored, right? It habituates to it, so it just kind of looks around, and then all of a sudden they roll it behind after a bunch of different times, and then they have a trapdoor that they kind of pull away the ball, or they do pull away the ball, and the drawbridge goes down and it appears to go through the ball, and all of a sudden the infants go, what? Like, oh my God, there's a change there. And so that's the idea that perhaps infants have the innate structure of object permanence to make sense of the world. And these innate structures are based on natural selection, that they're very adaptive and have enabled us through millions of years to develop this really awesome brain that is ready to go in a lot of ways in terms of learning. Face recognition as well. Infants at a very early age will turn towards faces versus shapes that look like faces but are have random patterns in it. An innate understanding of numbers. The idea with the language too is that kids have an innate understanding of what it means to be a noun, a verb, as well as numbers. And it's amazing having a kid, myself, that you see how quickly they pick up language and the concept of numbers. And then does the brain have biological and cognitive stages of development that are fixed? And they may vary from kid to kid in terms of the ages at which they start and stop and then commence to the next stage, but are they specific stages that everyone goes through that makes us universally human? And I think that's a fascinating debate. And continuity and discontinuity, that's the idea of does development, is it continuous? Does it just kind of like gradually kind of go up? Or is it discontinuous? It gradually goes up. There is continuity, but then all of a sudden it shoots up into another stage. And then universal versus context-specific development. Is there just one or multiple ways in which development occurs? Of course, nowadays, people are talking about the biopsychosocial framework, and then also talking about individual life cycle forces. The biopsychosocial framework integrates genetic, health-related biology with psychology, psychological forces, cognitive, perceptual, emotional, personality forces, as well as sociocultural. We can't forget how we are a person within society and culture and how all that influences us in terms of societal, cultural, ethnic, and interpersonal. And life cycle forces, how identical events can affect someone differently. And the book gives the example of having a child when someone's 18 versus 28 and how that kind of changes the trajectory of one's life. Really fascinating, kind of touching on, at least for the start, the idea of neuroscience and the idea of understanding the brain today, and the interesting thing of studying the brain activity and behavior relationships. It really helps in understanding the interactions among these four forces that we talked about. But I would pose the question that ultimately, are we not just a brain and body? Of course, brain controls body. And if yes, then aren't all behaviors, thoughts, emotions, your thoughts right now, even your sense of self and self-concept, ultimately tied to brain activity? Okay, it's sort of a reductionist, materialist point of view, but that kind of is what psychology is looking at right now, and that you can actually tell what people are thinking based on their brain activity. And so I know the Facebook engineers are getting really excited about that, right? To be able to tell what you're thinking, because of course they want to help humanity with that information. But anyway, we get to what is a theory, and book goes over. It's an organized set of ideas that is designed to explain development, right? We need to have an organizational kind of structure, and it's essential for developing, of course, predictions about behavior, and that's really what we want to do in psychology, is really be able to have a predictive force about behavior. And because predictions also result in research that helps to support or clarify the theory. So in addition to that, not because. Currently there are 5 general perspectives that influence human development research, and we're going to review these right now: psychodynamic, learning theory, behaviorism, essentially, as well as Bander's theory, cognitive theory, ecological and systems theory, lifespan perspective with selective optimization and with compensation, the SOC, and life course perspective. Seems a little overwhelming, but you read through them and it's like, okay, I got a grasp of this. Hopefully you do. And so basically this gives you an overview. I'm going to go over these in a little more detail. But you got your Erikson's psychosocial theory kind of resulted out of psychodynamic, and the nature of how you kind of go through a sequence of stages and such like that. Behaviorism, which is very incremental and continuous, and how the environment controls behavior through rewards and punishment. For example, you got Bandura's social learning theory, where kids learn a lot through imitation and not just through reward and punishment. Piaget's theory, really focusing on the cognitive changes that kids go through. Information processing, our mind's a computer. We got Vygotsky, taking a look at the influence of culture and society on development. Ecological theories of Bronfenbrenner's and competence environmental press, and so on. So let's jump into those. Kind of started with Sigge, at least, was the predecessor for Erikson. Just had the biological need for water and quenched it. Speaking about drives, right? Oh, we're talking about Sigmund Freud. Life is a struggle between drives, such as the id, the tripartite, the id, the superego, and the ego of our personality. The id is the sex and aggression, your animalistic nature. You got your superego, who is your internal critic or your parent saying, don't do that to the id. And then you've got your ego, your conscious self going, what? Okay, which one should I choose? The id or the superego? And kind of the reality principle or the pleasure principle, right? Should I indulge or should I just hold back and stuff? And that was Siggy. And then he really talked about also development too, how the child goes through stages. The oral stage where it's all about, the child and the breast are one and, everything's safe and wonderful and you're orally fixated. And then you go through toilet training, the anal stage, phallic stage where a kid goes through Oedipal or electric complex latency stage where you sublimate those id energies for sex and such into being productive, and then hitting puberty where we all know what happens there. Erik Erikson thought, there's a little too much focus on the sexual id kind of thing, and there's a lot more specific stages that kids go through, but they are still stages. And so he developed the psychosocial theory, which is kind of came out of psychodynamic theory. And personality development is a result of interaction between the internal maturational plan and external societal demands. So again, there's these biologically fixed life cycle stages, and there's 8 of them. There's the idea of the epigenetic principle, which is simply that each psychosocial strength has its own special period of importance, and that later stages are built upon the previous successful completion of the previous stages. And that change is very much discontinuous. So you're going to hop through this stage, and then go to the next stage and the next stage, and that each learning is a predecessor for future learning, that you can't have future learning without moving through the stages. And if you stall at these stages, you're going to look at neurotic problems in your life. And Erik Erikson really showed that as well. But successfully moving through these challenges, which are strewn with difficulties in life that you have to resolve, will lead towards a healthy personality development. So let's take a look at these stages, which are really kind of cool in terms of explaining, I don't know about you, but I think explaining some significant things that humans go through. And so you have the first stage in infancy, which is developing trust versus mistrust, and the successful resolution of the crisis you have right here, that really infants learn and children learn that the world is safe and that people are loving and reliable, and your ability to trust others, your ability to not freak out around every corner and stuff like that, that the sky is falling and stuff. Well, you have to thank your significant others who are providing that care, and versus being super paranoid and not being able to trust anyone. And later on, you're going to have to, right, in some of these other stages, learn to open up to others and be vulnerable. And one can see that might pose a significant problem if you developed some mistrust. So you resolve that, then you moved through, and of course you're moving into potty training, and the major psychological crisis is autonomy versus shame and doubt. The successful resolution of the crisis is you're encouraged to explore the environment, gain this autonomous feeling of independence, and as a result, positive self-esteem. If you are not encouraged to explore the environment and make mistakes, and you're shamed, for example, through potty training, then you will develop a lot of shame and doubt and some psychological problems as a result of that, Erikson would say. Yes, so initiative versus guilt is the age of 4 to 6, otherwise known as the preschool age, and children develop a sense of purpose by taking on responsibilities. And so they're encouraged to do things, and they kind of feel good about themselves, and they're purposeful. Here they feel that, I can be an autonomous, independent person, and now I'm encouraged to explore new things. And they also develop the capacity for feeling guilty for misdeeds. And if they're not encouraged to explore new things, they can become someone who's really afraid to try new things right there. And trying out new things and developing a sense of independence and developing a sense that the world is not dangerous really sets you up for grade school positively, I would say. And Then you're looking at being industrious, and this doesn't differ from Freud's kind of the way Freud looked at that in terms of latency. And here you're wanting to successfully work with others, assess how others view me, for example, and do I feel competent? So kids are always often comparing themselves to others to see if they're doing well in school, if they're doing well on the playground, different types of things like that. And that's important for kids because you develop your sense of self, you know, in the school, on the playground during that time. Okay, so the next one is identity versus role confusion, and of course that's when you hit adolescence and puberty, right? When you're really trying to find out who you are and make sense of the world and who you're going to be in terms of when you become an adult, right? And what roles you're going to take on in terms of a job, a family, a mother, a father, who you are as an individual, that type of stuff, right and wrong, all that type of stuff, right? So you're exploring different social roles and you develop a sense of identity versus role confusion. And so really that's what college age, when you first jump into college right out of high school, you're really hoping to carve a future identity, and one of those things is through college and then getting a great job as a result of you've researched all these different things that you can do from college, right? And then you're thinking about specifically, here's what I want to do. And you have that clear track, right? Well, if you don't, you can still explore that, right? Taking some GE classes, whatever, that's cool. You do your exploration phase, but make sure while you're exploring, you also do some research because it can do some fantastic things for you. Okay, off of the pulpit for a little bit here. And what are we doing also now in our 20s? We're looking towards developing some intimate relationships or not being isolated. And so we're really looking to open up and develop some long-term relationships, at least some of us are. And middle adulthood, 30s to 50s, generativity versus stagnation. And we're gaining a sense that we're leaving behind a positive legacy and caring for future generations. So hopefully that's what we're carving out, because we're setting ourselves up for a nice 60s and beyond where we experience integrity versus despair. We look back at our lives of what we did and we remember all of these wonderful things and how we did things for others and lived a good life. Okay, so the next kind of area that looks at human development is going to be behaviorism. And of course, I threw this in, it's the whole classical conditioning, which is a type of learned response in which a neutral object comes to elicit a response when it's associated with a stimulus that already produces a response. And so I gave the classic example of your dog Pavlov. And of course, Pavlov salivates when you feed him, right? But then all of a sudden you start ringing a bell when you feed Pavlov. You do it over and over. Each time you feed him, you ring a bell. And then what happens is you ring a bell. And then Pavlov, the dog, starts to salivate. And normally just a bell does not make a dog salivate, but the dog has associated the bell with the food. And so they figured that out and they call that classical conditioning. Now, who talked about operant conditioning? This guy right here, this cool guy. Let's get all those terms out there. Come on. Here we go. And operant conditioning, think about operating on the environment. It's a type of associative learning where we learn the relationship between a behavior and its consequences, and which of the consequences of an action determine the likelihood that the action will be performed in the future. We do something, we get rewarded. That means we're more than likely going to do that thing over and over. We do something, we get punished. We're more than likely to stop doing that. That's the very simple thing. Reinforcement, increase. Oh, so this is kind of the kick down of what is reinforcement, what is punishment. It's pretty simple when you break it down. Let's break it down now. Reinforcement increases the chance that a behavior will be repeated. Increases the chance that a behavior will be repeated, while punishment decreases the chance that a behavior will be repeated. Okay, so reinforcement, increase behavior, goal, right? Punishment, decrease behavior. Is that really all it is? Yeah. And now positive and negative. So they also throw that along, right? Positive stimulus, or positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. So positive is you add a stimulus, and negative is you remove a stimulus. Okay? So let's take a look at it. Positive reinforcement. If you do this behavior, clean your room, say to my daughter, you will get something positive. Candy, tokens, money, praise. Good job. She's like, what? I didn't get, no, not this time, just some praise. Okay. Yeah, and so that's positive reinforcement, right? Increased behavior, get something positive, right? Add a stimulus. Negative reinforcement, increased behavior. If you do this behavior, clean your room, same thing, right? But a little different here because negative reinforcement, I will take away something negative or aversive. You don't have to do the dishes. Negative reinforcement. If you do this behavior, increased behavior, I will remove something negative. Dishes. What's punishment? There's positive and negative punishment. Positive and negative punishment, really? There's positive and negative. Okay, that sounds kind of weird, but anyway, did to me. Positive punishment. So what are we trying to do? We are trying to decrease behavior. So you add an aversive stimulus is the example of positive punishment. You scold a child and you're trying to get them to quit being messy, for example, or quit getting in trouble at school. So you're trying to decrease that behavior of getting in trouble at school. And negative punishment is also called response costs, and that's where you remove a good thing. So they got their privileges taken away because little Johnny was, bad at school. And the idea here is change is continuous. Social learning theory, Albert Bandura, 1925 onward. He's still alive. How fantastic is that? Social cognitive theory came up with that people learn without reward or punishment. This was in a response to behaviorism, and it's social and cognitive. How is it cognitive? People actively try to understand what goes on in their world. They're not just passively responding to the environment through rewards and punishments. And it's social, along with reinforcement and punishment. Watching what people do and imitating them is an important aspect of learning. And he basically goes over those three things here, which are observational learning, and that's watching others. So that's how kids learn. They learn through watching others. And what do? They model or imitate others. Imitation is more likely, according to the book, when the subject of observation is seen as smart, popular, or talented. So that's why my daughter listens to Jojo Siwa more than me, or she's more talented than me or popular. I don't know about smart, but my daughter thinks she's smarter than me, so yeah, she's probably not imitating me too much. But you notice how they tend to imitate their peers more, perhaps, than the parents in a lot of instances, and so that's kind of interesting. But anyway, I digress. Vicarious conditioning is imitation is more likely when the subject of observation is rewarded for the behavior. So if you see someone getting punished for a behavior, like, I'm not going to do that. If you see someone, oh, great job, you're going to be like, little Johnny's going to be like, hey, maybe I'll do that. Okay. And then we got self-efficacy, and that's your people's beliefs about their own abilities and talents, and that affects future choices. So if we believe that we are someone who can accomplish a task, we're more likely to do the task. We'd be more likely to be more motivated to do the task. Cognitive developmental theory, three approaches, Piaget, information processing, and Vygotsky. Piaget we developed in universal discrete stages, and these are really looking at the cognition, the changes in the way that kids think. And we're going to go over that in a sec here. And then information processing, like computers, we become more efficient at processing information as we mature and get older. We'll go over that. And Vygotsky, that really society and culture influence you. And then Jean Piaget, and there's his dates right there. He studies his own kids. So how's that for a sample? And are those kids representative of the whole population? That's, some people question. He looked at different ways that children think about the world and themselves and the way that they process and understand the world. And he was really revolutionary at the time because he kind of responded to that people aren't little adults, that they actually have different stages, and we should take a look at those, and we shouldn't, think that all kids are the same, regardless of their age. And he said that children naturally try to make sense of the world and act like scientists. You can really see this a lot when interacting with kids, creating theories about the physical and social worlds. They push something off the table and notice that, hey, I can do that and I can change things in the world. Really exciting for them. So they start pushing everything off the table, right? Through experience, a child expects certain things to happen. When they do, a child's belief in her theory grows stronger. When the predicted events do not occur, child, revises the theory. Piaget also believed, though, that there were discontinuous moments in cognitive development where they had to accommodate and really change in thinking. And he believed that you have these stages, and that change is discontinuous, that there's these discontinuous great changes. The epigenesis. And let's take a look at those. We've got sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. Sensory motor, birth to 2 years. People now say they're not really held fast on these years. They say that he was over-predicting when they're actually a little younger. But that'll be in more detail later. Let's just go over this. So the kid really starts to mentally represent information acquired through the senses and motor exploration. That's the idea of sensory motor, right? Begins to act intentionally, pulls a string in a mobile to see things in motion, wow, or shake a rattle, woohoo, cool, right? And press something and then you have a light switch, cool. Achieves object permanence, realizing that things continue to exist even when they're no longer present to the senses. And then goes to the pre-operational stage, and that's 2 to 7 years, where you do all those really fun tasks with pouring water, tall skinny glass and too short fat glass, is it the same amount of water and stuff like that. Conservation tasks. Learns to use language and represent objects by images and words. Thinking is egocentric, where the child's difficulty taking the viewpoints of others. Can think intuitively but not logically, and classifies objects by a single feature. Concrete operational, we'll go into more detail in this later on Piaget and the stages later in the chapters, but I just want to kind of give you some touch on it, so it kind of sets the stage for all that stuff later. So now you move into the concrete operational, where the child is actually saying, when you start pouring the glasses, oh, it's the same amount of water and different stuff like that. And that's what it means by achieves conservation of number, volume, mass, and weight. That particular example was volume. And they can think logically about concrete objects, but they're not abstract thinkers yet, which becomes the formal operation later. Oh, they can also flexibly classify objects by several features, which is not indicative of the pre-operational. So you can really see in terms of brain development that they're getting bigger memory capacity. And who is really interested in memory capacity? Oops, some problem here. What did I do? Let's see. That's information processing theory. Not sure what I did there, but it uses the computer as a model of how thinking develops. And as such, there's mental hardware and mental software. Our mental hardware is our brain, and cognitive structures such as actual memory, where actual memories are stored. Brain structures such as the hippocampus and different areas of the cortex, amygdala, etc., subcortex, of where memories are stored. Mental software, cognitive abilities that allow us to process information and help us interact with the world. For example, strategic processes to memorize information, such as creating associations. And basically, change is continuous in the sense that as you get older, your software and hardware improves. Vygotsky, Lev Vygotsky, and here's the date there. And he really emphasized sociocultural influences on child development and cultural transmission, and views development as an apprenticeship where we basically learn based on the society that we're in. So, nowadays, modern society, you might, be forced into certain things to become, psychologist, doctor, lawyer, or whatever that you're planning to be. And maybe in some other place where, the emphasis is on goat herding or fishing or something like that, you might become someone who fishes or something like that, or herds goats. And so then there's the ecological and systems approach, and the ecological theory of Bronfenbrenner and competence environmental press theory. Human development is inseparable from the environmental context in which a person develops. All aspects of human development are interconnected, and no single aspect can adequately explain development, and you need to really consider all factors: the environment, family, school, friends, neighborhood, political and social milieu, etc., and how they interact. So really talking about the system in which one lives in, and how this sort of systems approach of looking at the individual is not just an island in the stream, but is a part of the greater ocean, if you will, of society. And that was Yuri Bronfenbrenner's theory, the ecological approach, where you've got these microsystems, mesosystems, exosystem, and macrosystem, and you're really embedded within these different holons, as what they used to call them, at least when I was in grad school. The microsystem is the people and objects in your immediate environment, really, that influence the child. That would, of course, be the parents, family, school, friends. The mesosystem is all it is just how these microsystems interact with one another. That's it. The exosystem is the neighborhood, parents' workplace. It's more the less kind of direct interactive with the child, but they do affect the parents, for example, and social milieu and government policy can affect the children too, as we can see in this, especially in this modern political climate. And with the macro system as well, of course, there's a larger cultural setting, ethnic groups, as well as historical events that can affect child development. And there it is there. I don't like how they put school and friends in the mesosystem here. They're really, mesosystem is just different interactions of the microsystem, so that might be confusing. Anyway, Lawton and Hemoff's competence environmental press theory. What's this all about? Adaptation or development depends on the match between person's abilities or competencies and the demands the environment or presses places on the person. Oh, that kind of makes sense, right? That's kind of cool. All right. Kind of reminds me of the Yerkes-Dodson law. I think it is. Anyone related to Yerkes? It's like Yerkes or whatever, Write me an email. Sorry about that. 1908, and it talked about how there's an optimal performance level, and it's when we have optimal arousal. And when we're overly aroused, we get impaired performance, such as anxiety, and that impairs our performance. And if we're under aroused, we're bored, so we're impaired performance too. So it kind of reminds me of that, but it talks about more like the optimal level where your competencies are matching the environment. But that kind of seems similar in some ways. Kind of reminded me of that. That's all. Paul Baltus, 1939-2006. And no single period of a person's life can be understood apart from its origins and its consequences. I seem to want to put all those words together. This is a lifespan perspective, by the way. To understand a specific period, we must know what came before and what came afterward. That makes sense, right? Okay? Like our lives are determined by our earlier experiences. 4 key features: multi-directionality, development involved in growth, in both growth and decline. And as I get older, I get wiser, for example. but my memory skills and brain energy depletion and repletion weakens. I ought to be young again, right? And put in all those 6 hours, 7 hours, study sessions or whatever, and just be able to pop back up after 3 or 4 hours sleep, take that exam. Well, hopefully you're not cramming, right? But yeah, you could do that, right? I do one of those things, like 7, 8 hour study sessions. I could do it maybe for like 2 days straight, and then I'm just like, I'm cashed out. And when I was young, I could probably do like 3 days straight, right? Anyway, kind of like, now I'm old, I drink 1 beer. It's like, I'm done. Okay, maybe college was a different thing. Maybe 2. Plasticity, well, there are limits. One's brain capacity is moldable, so okay, cool. So multi-directionality, we've got, gains and, sometimes we're going downhill. Understand that. Plasticity, that means that your brain is moldable. So just because you have all these experiences of reward and punishment, stuff like that, you're not set in stone. You have free will to be able to determine your direction, or relatively free will, right? And you can grow your brain, and this is the idea of growth mindset and neuroplasticity, that when you learn, your brain is billions of connections, and when you learn, you're making new connections. And you can unlearn things and relearn new skills, stuff like that. Is there a limit to that? Yeah, I'm not going to become Einstein, and, I'm pretty good at statistics, teach statistics, but like I study like other stuff, like calculus and stuff, it hurts my brain, stuff like that. So, there's probably some limits, especially as I get older. But, give yourself a break. Come on, I'm forgetting about neuroplasticity. There is hope that I will, discover the next theory greater than general relativity, Einstein. Who knows? I don't know. But I do embrace the idea that if you work through problems, your brain gets stronger, your brain gets smarter, and that's the idea of growth mindset. Check it out. And neuroplasticity, long-term potentiation. Historical context, we cannot separate the time in which we live as a major influence on our lives, and there's multiple causation, and that's the biopsychosocial model with life forces. Kind of cool, right? Baltus, okay. So he's kind of, you can see people are kind of building on everything, saying it's not either this nor this, maybe it's all of it. And he continued to talk about this selective optimization with compensation model. And we select things, and it describes the as well as we try and create the optimal environments and compensate when we can't. Describes the adaptation process for people as they age. They make selection or choices, and then they compensate and optimize as a way to maintain and enhance their choices. So there's a couple types of selection, and elective selection is a reduced involvement with one goal due to increased demands. So the example they gave is a student leaves a club because they have increased demands like going to work. So you select out, right? Opting out. And then loss-based selection again, selecting out. Reduced involvement because of lack of resources or abilities. That's older people stop going to church because they can't drive anymore. At least that's what they say, right? And then compensation is you don't select out. You find an alternative way of meeting the goals. So you can't drive to church, so you go take the bus, right? And then optimization is we try and minimize losses and maximize gains when we are engaging in those compensation processes. And it's a dynamic process of selecting the right goals and compensating when possible to help maximize the odds of achieving them. Think of myself, or Michael Jordan. How am I really compare myself to Michael Jordan in the same breath? Well, not quite, but we both switch from playing something like in a more intense sport to playing something like golf when we get older. Okay, so we still got that competitive edge, right? But he's not gonna go dunk on, I don't know, LeBron. Okay, so life course perspective, different generations experience adjust to biological, psychosocial forces within the time period of their lives. And it's the idea of personal life events interact with historical influences, right? We're not an island in the stream, and if you're born in World War II in a certain, country, certain ethnicity or whatever, could be significantly different than being born of that same ethnicity in that same country, many years later. Personal life events interact with historical influences. So individual issues integrate with family issues. How do people balance individual lives with raising a family or being part of a family, and earlier life events, period of history in which they occurred, shape subsequent events. And that's the idea of if you were born, let's say, as an 18-year-old during the draft age during Vietnam, like my uncle was, and then he ended up going to Vietnam, and another uncle who was born afterwards and didn't have to go. And so the idea is, can that significantly influence your life and the events? And it does, yeah. Okay, and then they are right there. So hopefully you got a better understanding of the different theoretical perspectives on human development, psychodynamic learning, cognitive, and those, as well as the ecological systems, lifespan, and life course perspective. Okay, so the next area of the text goes over the idea of different types of measurement in human development research. Systematic observation, there's two types: naturalistic observation, which is just real life observations, and then structured observations, where you create a situation and likely to result in the type of behavior in which they're interested in studying. Famous marshmallow study was an example of that, where they told the kids to, they put a marshmallow in front of a kid, like 3 to 5 year old kids. And they said, we're going to leave the room, and if you don't eat the marshmallow, when we come back, we'll give you 2 marshmallows. And some kids ate the marshmallow, and some kids waited and then got 2 marshmallows. And the kids that had self-control and waited ended up doing better in school and better in life later on, stuff like that. So it's kind of interesting. Sampling behavior with tasks. So we got systematic observation. Sampling behavior with tasks. So example they give is showing photos to measure emotion recognition accuracy, or giving a kid the Piaget's conservation tasks. And self-reports, where you measure self-esteem with a questionnaire, for example. And physiological measures, for example, measuring interest level using the galvanometric skin response or pupil dilation. You can also look at brain activity too. Come up to electrodes or look at their fMRI, stuff like that. Reliability and validity are just two concepts in experimental psychology and in science in general. Reliability: does this method consistently measure what is being studied? An example, an IQ test yielding identical scores when given twice over a 2-week interval, book gives. Or I give the example of a scale giving the same weight over the course of several measurements, like in the same day. You're not going to change weight significantly throughout the same day unless you're doing a before and after, see how much I can scarf at the buffet or something like that. Anyway, and then there's validity. And validity is, does this accurately measure the variable of interest? Example, does a personality test, or IQ test for that matter, truly measure intelligence, or a personality test truly measure level of aggressiveness? Is the scale, as I gave the example, may be reliable. It may give you the same results over several tests, but is it accurate? So I'm like, what? I lost 15 pounds. This scale's awesome. It keeps telling me the same thing too. 15 pounds lost, 15 pounds lost, 15 pounds lost. And I haven't even worked out or done anything. In fact, I've eaten a little more. Okay, so population and sample. So you're always in psychology, you're always trying to make basically statements about the population. But can you do experiments on like the whole population of all high school students in the US? No. It's not reasonable, right? It's you can't do it. Can't do it. And so you have to take a sample from the population, and that's a subset of people chosen to well represent the population. For example, you can randomly select 200 high school students from across the US. General research designs, we're going to talk about correlational studies and experimental studies. Correlational studies measure relations between variables as they exist naturally in the world. As one thing rises, does the other rise? We're not manipulating them in an experiment, these variables, okay? So I give the example of exercise and grades. As you increase your exercise, do your grades also go up? Okay. So you calculate a correlation coefficient between the two variable scores, which range between a negative 1.0 and a positive 1.0. So that's when you get a correlation coefficient. You can get a chi-square, Pearson, whatever. Depends on the variable you're using, but there's different statistical methods you can do for correlation. And you're looking at the size or strength or magnitude, and that's regardless of the sign, shows how much the scores on one variable can predict the other's variable scores. So forget about the sign for now, just look at the number, okay? 0 means there's no relationship between these. Okay, you're saying as I increase in exercise, my grades don't increase. Okay. Nor do they decrease. Okay. And 1 is the strongest relationship. It's like a direct one-to-one correlation. As I do one thing, the other one goes up too. Okay. Sign, on the other hand, whether it's positive or negative, indicates the direction of the relation between variables. For example, it tells you if the relationship is positive, as one goes up, so does the other. Okay. Or negative, as one goes up, the other goes down, and that would be an inverse relationship. I'm going to show you a slide here that will show the example of that and make this, make it all make sense. Okay. So positive correlation, a relationship between variables characterized by an increase in one variable that occurs with an increase in the other variable. And I give the example of exercise and grades. So the number of hours of exercises here, let's say, well, that's a lot of hours, right? All right, we'll do minutes. Number of minutes of exercises here. And the grades are here on the vertical axis, okay? And so as you can see, as the minutes of exercise increase, what happens to the grades? They increase as well. So these are all individual scores, right? So one person is not exercising that much, and they're not getting very good grades. And a lot of people over here, as they exercise more and more, so these are all individual scores or grades for people. Okay. Now I have also over here the example of a negative correlation, okay? So negative correlation, a relationship exists between variables characterized by an increase in one variable that occurs with a decrease in the other variable. And I give the example of exercise and stress, okay? So your stress level right here is, is it high or low? And as you see, as the amount of exercise increases, what happens to the stress level for people as they report it? It goes down. So that's a negative correlation. Okay, let's to the next slide. Correlational studies, remember, examine the relationship between measured dependent variables. They just show relationships. They don't prove causality. And it's really for two reasons. The book only goes over one. I'm going to go over two. One's called the third variable problem, and the other one's called the directionality problem. Third variable problem, I like to pose as, every morning I brush my teeth. Every morning the sun comes up, well, you know what I mean, rises in the east. And afterwards, sunrise in the east. There's a direct one-to-one positive correlation between the two. Does this mean that brushing my teeth causes the sun to rise in the east every morning? Of course, we know that that is not true. Let's say I didn't brush my teeth, the sun would still come up. Infers, hey, maybe there's something else going on, and that's another variable, a third variable. Directionality problem, when I'm stressed out, I have problems with sleeping. When I have problems with sleeping, I get stressed out. So which causes which? You don't know which direction is which, right? So we can manipulate those, right? In an experiment, sleep deprivation experiments, very popular. And then we can tell what causes what, but not in a correlational study. Correlation does not tell you about causation. Could imply it, but it doesn't tell you for sure, okay? Experimental methods do test causation, and there are research methods that test causal hypotheses by manipulating the independent variable and measuring the effects on the dependent variable. So you basically create two conditions and you manipulate the independent variable. That's the variable you're manipulating in one condition, but not the other. and the conditions are all the same otherwise. And then you measure the changes and the changes are the responses or whatever on their dependent variable. I'm going to give you an example of that. So variables and operational definitions, independent variable, the variable that we manipulate and examine its impact on the dependent variable. That's the variable that is affected by the manipulation of the independent variable. And so let's say I give, one group caffeine and another group no caffeine or a fake caffeine pill, and I'm testing them. I give them a list of words to remember, and then I test them, and their memory responses, the responses that they get correct are going to be their dependent variable. And the independent variable in this example is going to be what? It's the pill, right? Did they get caffeine or not? Operational definition is basically the detailed description of these. So pill or no pill or placebo, and number of correct responses. And those are the operational on the memory test, and those are the operational definitions. We got your control group and your experimental group. The control group gets the fake pill, and the experimental group gets the caffeine, the real deal. And control is necessary to determine causality. A properly performed experiment depends on rigorous control. A confound is anything that affects a dependent variable and may unintentionally vary between the study's different experimental conditions. So let's say you have like one room where you put the people, it's really noisy because someone's hammering next door. You didn't have control over it. You tried your best, right? Rent these rooms. They told you they were going to be quiet, but they're hammering. And that might affect the memory test. And that's called a what? Confound? Yeah. Random assignment is one way to remove confounds. Also get rid of that hammering thing next door, right? And it's basically placing research participants in the conditions of an experiment such that the experiment has, each participant in the experiment has an equal chance of being assigned to any level of the independent variable, okay? So you're basically going to randomly assign people into two groups. Don't take people that come into McDonald's. Let's say you're studying people that come to McDonald's in the memory test. Don't take the early morning risers and put them into the caffeine group, and the late morning risers, put them into the non-caffeine group, because you could be testing early morning risers. Sampling, random sample is a sample that fairly represents the population by allowing each member of the population an equal chance to be included. So that's the idea. You want to look at the population, but you can't study them, right? So you randomly sample people from the population to make sure that they're representative of the population, and then you randomly assign them into either the control or experimental group. Pick a number out of a hat, and it's either going to be 1 or 2. 1 you go in that group, 2 you go in the other group. And this is just the example of that experiment that I was talking about, where you give them, excuse me, the caffeine pill or the non-caffeine pill. And then you have your data, and you use statistics to see if the non-caffeine scores or the caffeine scores are better than the non-caffeine scores. And statistics will tell you that, and the probability of getting your scores by error or chance.